Chapter 1: Early Life and Family. Fidel Alejandro Castro Ruz was born on August 13, 1926 in Byron, a rural community in the province of Holguin, Cuba. He was the eldest son of a family that combined both rural and urban influences, and whose roots were closely linked to Cuba's colonial and post-colonial history. Castro's father, Angel Castro, came from Galicia in Spain and had emigrated to Cuba. He was initially a worker who eventually became wealthy through land purchases and entrepreneurship. Fidel grew up on a sugar plantation run by his father. This rural environment shaped his early experiences of inequality and social hierarchy. The work on the plantation, the life of the day laborers, and the gap between wealthy landowners and workers left Castro with an early awareness of social injustice. The Castro family was large. Fidel had a total of 7 siblings, some of whom later became politically active themselves. The family structure was characterized by a strict upbringing, Catholic religion, and a mixture of Spanish and Cuban traditions. His father's connection to his Spanish heritage led to a deep awareness of colonial history and cultural identity, while life on the sugar plantation exposed economic inequality and social tensions. These early observations shaped Castro's later political thinking, especially his emphasis on social justice and national independence. Fidel first received a basic education on the plantation and later at nearby secondary schools. From an early age, he showed intellectual interest, a critical attitude towards authority, and a passion for debate. His education was both formal and practical. In addition to reading history books, political writings, and literary works, he learned from the experiences of daily life, especially by observing the working conditions of plantation workers and the social structure of Cuba in the 1930s and 1940s. The discrepancy between the living environment of the poor and the prosperity of the plantation owners sensitized him to questions of social inequality and led to an early political sensitivity. Cuba's political landscape in Castro's youth was characterized by instability, corruption, and external influences. The U.S. had considerable influence on Cuban politics and economy, especially on sugar production, trade, and banking. Corruption, authoritarian governments, and social tensions were omnipresent. This political environment gave young intellectuals such as Fidel Castro reason to reflect on reforms, national sovereignty, and social justice. From an early age, he was interested in political movements that opposed social inequality and foreign interference, which paved the way for his later role as a revolutionary. In addition to political awareness, personal experience played a central role. Fidel experienced firsthand the strict hierarchy on the plantation, the dependence of the workers on the landowners, and the hardships of rural life. These experiences strengthened his sense of social justice and his will to bring about change. At the same time, he showed qualities early on that later contributed to his political career: leadership, persuasiveness, strategic thinking, and strong assertiveness. In summary, Fidel Castro's early life laid a crucial foundation for his later political career. Family, education, personal experiences on the plantation, and the social environment shaped his views on inequality, social justice, and national sovereignty. The combination of observations of poverty, privileged lifestyles, and political instability formed a young man who developed a strong awareness of social grievances at an early age and was motivated to become active. These influences formed the basis for his later political activities, his role as a revolutionary, and finally as Cuba's head of state, who decisively influenced the political, social, and economic development of the island for decades. Chapter 2: Education and Political Influence. Fidel Castro's education and political influence form a decisive period in his life, which transformed him from a privileged youth on the sugar plantation into one of the central political actors of the 20th century. After primary school on his family's plantation, Castro attended various secondary schools that promoted his intellectual abilities and shaped his political interests. He was initially sent to private schools, where the curriculum was heavily focused on classical education, religion, discipline, and moral values. Even during this time, Castro showed an extraordinary talent for debate, analysis of historical and political contexts, and strategic thinking. His school environment laid the foundations for his later rhetorical skills and his ability to convince people of political ideas. A formative influence on Castro's youth was the experience of social inequality and injustice. On his father's sugar plantation, he witnessed the living conditions of day laborers, whose hard work was often poorly paid, while landowners and wealthy merchants had great influence. These observations led to an early awareness of class differences, social tensions, and power relations. At the same time, he experienced the privileges of his own family, which gave him access to education, travel, and cultural capital. The tension between these two worlds, social inequality on the one hand and the relative security of his own family on the other, shaped his first political views and interest in social justice. His school career eventually led him to the Jesuit College in Santiago de Cuba, an institution rich in tradition that placed a strong emphasis on academic excellence, discipline, and ethical education. Here Castro expanded his knowledge of history, literature, philosophy, and politics. He read works by classical thinkers as well as contemporary writings on society, economics, and politics. He was particularly fascinated by the analysis of social conflicts, revolutions, and political movements in different countries. During this phase, he developed a keen interest in the mechanisms of power, oppression, and resistance, which later had a significant influence on his revolutionary practice. Parallel to his school education, Fidel began to actively engage with Cuban politics. Political developments in Cuba during the 1940s were marked by instability, corruption, and the influence of the United States. Changes of president, authoritarian regimes, and social tensions were part of everyday life. Castro was particularly interested in reform movements, nationalist ideas, and social justice. As a teenager, he took part in political discussions, critically examined the role of the United States in Cuba, and showed a clear sympathy for movements that propagated social reforms and national sovereignty. This early political conflict was closely linked to his intellectual career and laid the basis for his later commitment against the Batista regime. Castro's studies at the University of Havana were another decisive step. He began studying law, which gave him both legal knowledge and a deeper understanding of political structures, constitutional law, and international relations. At the same time, the university was a center of political activity, where students held discussions about nationalism, socialism, democracy, and corruption. Fidel was active in student associations, participated in debates, organized events, and networked with like-minded people who influenced his political thinking. The university offered him not only intellectual impulses, but also practical experience of political mobilization. A formative influence on Castro's political development was his encounter with various ideologies and movements, including Marxist socialism, Cuban nationalism, and Latin American reform movements. Castro critically analyzed these currents, learned from their strategies, and reflected on their applicability to Cuba. His ability to combine theoretical knowledge with practical politics was already evident in this phase. He understood political power as an instrument to overcome social inequality and secure national sovereignty. The mixture of intellectual education, political activity, and personal experiences on the plantation formed a young man who was both analytical and action-oriented. In summary, Fidel Castro's education and political background formed a crucial basis for his later role as a revolutionary and leader. The combination of academic education, intellectual curiosity, practical political experience, and observations of social injustice shaped his view of Cuba, his ideals, and his strategies. He developed a deep understanding of power structures, social hierarchies, and the mechanisms of political change. These early years laid the foundation for his later rise, rhetorical skills, strategic planning, and ability to mobilize people, making him a central figure in the Cuban Revolution and international politics of the 20th century. Chapter 3: Early Political Activities. Fidel Castro's early political activities laid the foundation for his later rise as a revolutionary and Cuban head of state. Already during his school years and during his studies at the University of Havana, Castro showed a pronounced sensitivity to social inequality, political corruption, and national independence. These early experiences motivated him to actively participate in political events, to conduct debates, to form organizations, and to exchange ideas with like-minded people about the future of Cuba. The early political phase of his life was marked by a combination of intellectual reflection, practical experience, and personal commitment, which decisively influenced his later strategy and ideology. During his studies at the University of Havana, Castro began to get involved in student associations and political groups. He participated in debates on political reforms, social justice, and the role of the United States in Cuban politics. The university was a center of political activity, where students exchanged ideas, distributed leaflets, and organized protests. Fidel used this platform to spread his views, build networks, and gain his first experience in organizing political actions. These activities demonstrated his ability to mobilize other people for political ideas and strategically plan political movements. Castro was particularly motivated by the social inequality he had observed both on his father's sugar plantation and in urban centers of Cuba. The gap between prosperity and poverty, between political elites and ordinary citizens, was obvious and politically relevant to him. Even at this early stage, he developed a strong awareness of class differences and the need for reforms to improve the living conditions of the majority of the population. For him, poverty and social injustice were perceived not only as a moral problem, but also as a structural phenomenon that required political solutions. One of the central themes in Castro's early political activities was resistance to authoritarian rule and corruption. In the 1940s, Cuba experienced several political upheavals in which changes of power, election manipulation, and the influence of external actors, especially the USA, determined the political landscape. Fidel sharply criticized these structures and advocated reforms that would expand political participation and reduce social inequality. His early actions included organizing demonstrations, writing critical articles, participating in debates, and networking with other opposition forces. Even in this phase, his talent for political mobilization and rhetorical persuasiveness became apparent. Castro was also heavily influenced by international political movements. The experience of the social reform movements in Latin America, the ideals of nationalism, the developments in Mexico and Argentina, and the ideas of socialism shaped his political vision. He systematically studied political theories and strategies aimed at overcoming authoritarian regimes and establishing social justice. In doing so, he combined theoretical knowledge with practical experience, which made his political activities both ideologically sound and tactically well thought out. Another focus was Castro's commitment to the rights of farmers and workers. He recognized early on that the majority of the Cuban population lived in precarious conditions, especially in rural areas dominated by plantation farming. Castro organized meetings to discuss workers' living conditions, promote their rights, and demand policies to improve their situation. This showed his early orientation towards social justice and the ability to integrate concrete social concerns into his political work. The early phase of his political activities was also marked by conflicts with established political forces. Castro's involvement met with resistance from conservative circles, state authorities, and rival political groups. These confrontations led to their first experiences with repression, political intrigue, and the need for strategic planning. Fidel learned the importance of organization, loyalty, tactics, and perseverance to achieve political goals. These lessons were crucial to his later role as a revolutionary and leader. In summary, Fidel Castro's early political activities formed a crucial basis for his later career. They combined intellectual reflection, practical experience, strategic action, and moral commitment. Even in this phase, his talent for mobilizing people, building networks, and systematically pursuing political goals became apparent. The issues of social justice, national sovereignty, resistance to authoritarianism, and the rights of peasants and workers shaped his political agenda and formed the basis for his later role as a central actor in the Cuban Revolution. These early experiences made Castro a political leader who acted both theoretically and practically, preparing him for the complex challenges associated with taking power and shaping a new Cuba. Chapter 4: Resistance to Batista. Fidel Castro's resistance to the regime of Fulgencio Batista marks a decisive turning point in Cuban history and in Castro's political career. Batista, who originally came to power through a coup d'état in 1933 and regained the presidency in 1952, led an authoritarian regime marked by corruption, violence, and close ties to foreign interests, especially the United States. Political oppression, economic inequality, and the marginalization of broad sections of the population led to growing resentment and formed the basis for organized opposition. Castro recognized early on that fundamental change could only be achieved through direct resistance to the regime and began his activities, which later led to the Cuban Revolution. Castro's commitment against Batista developed from the experiences of his early political activities, his intellectual imprint, and his observations of social injustice. When Batista came to power in 1952, shortly before the planned presidential elections, Castro perceived it as an attack on democratic principles and political legitimacy. For him and many of his contemporaries, the coup was clear evidence of the need to fight the authoritarian system that systematically promoted corruption, political oppression, and social inequality. The perception of the political crisis strengthened Castro's determination to take active action against the government. The first steps of resistance were both political and military. Castro organized small groups of like-minded people to raise awareness of the need for resistance and reform. He collected information about the government, planned actions to weaken Batista, and sought supporters among students, intellectuals, and opposition forces. His activities included both high-profile actions, such as leaflet campaigns and demonstrations, as well as the preparation of armed measures. This dual approach reflected its strategic ability to combine both political mobilization and military planning. A striking event in this phase was the attack on the Moncada Barracks on the 26th of July, 1953. This attempt to take over a major military installation and create the basis for a larger revolutionary movement failed militarily, but showed the determination of Castro and his comrades in arms. Although the action failed and many participants were killed or captured, it gained great symbolic significance. The attack made Castro known nationwide, presented him as a determined resistance fighter, and laid the ideological foundation for later revolutionary activities. His famous defense speech La Historia me absolverá, during the subsequent trial, presented his political principles and strengthened his image as a leader of moral integrity who was willing to fight for social justice. The defeat in the attack on Moncada led to a period of reorganization and strategic planning. Castro used his time in prison to write political texts, formulate the ideology of resistance, and win new supporters. His argumentation combined national sovereignty, social justice, and political participation and appealed to broad sections of the population. This phase of ideological development was crucial to create the basis for a sustainable revolutionary movement and to strengthen the commitment of its followers. After his release in 1955, Castro continued his activities in exile, especially in Mexico, where he joined forces with other revolutionary forces. There he organized the training and planning of future actions, including the formation of the group Los 26 de Julio, named after the failed attack on Moncada. The period of exile allowed him to forge strategic alliances, secure logistical resources, and consolidate the ideological coherence of the movement. This period was crucial to raise the resistance to a national level and to create the conditions for the return to Cuba. Castro's opposition to Batista was effective both politically and symbolically. Politically, he showed the possibility of organized opposition, demonstrated the weaknesses of the regime, and set the stage for a larger revolutionary movement. Symbolically, his commitment conveyed the message that resistance to oppression and injustice is possible and that moral and strategic action is necessary to bring about social change. The early actions, despite military setbacks, laid the ideological, organizational, and strategic basis for the later Cuban Revolution. To sum up, Fidel Castro's opposition to Batista was a combination of political mobilization, strategic planning, ideological development, and symbolic action. The experiences in this phase shaped his skills as a leader, his ability to organize, his rhetorical strength, and his determination. Resistance to Batista showed how Castro combined military, political, and ideological elements to plan long-term social change. This phase of his life was crucial in laying the foundations for the eventual success of the Cuban Revolution and his position as Cuba's central political figure. Chapter 5. The Cuban Revolution, Beginning. The beginning of the Cuban Revolution marks a turning point in Cuba's history and is closely linked to Fidel Castro's strategic, ideological, and organizational actions. After the failed actions against the Batista regime, in particular the attack on the Moncada Barracks in 1953, Castro continued his activities in exile and prepared the ground for a comprehensive revolutionary movement. The Cuban Revolution was not the result of spontaneous uprisings, but the result of long-term planning, political mobilization, ideological coherence, and strategic alliances. It was in this phase that the vision of an independent, socially just Cuba was formulated, which formed the core of the later revolutionary strategy. After his release from prison in 1955, Castro moved to Mexico, where he used his exile to gather a new group of comrades in arms. This phase was crucial as it allowed him to mobilize both military and political resources. In Mexico, he met Ernesto Che Guevara, an Argentine physician and revolutionary whose experience, tactical skills, and ideological commitment were decisive for the later military phase of the revolution. The collaboration between Castro and Guevara combined strategic thinking with revolutionary ideology and prepared the way for the return to Cuba in a way that was both militarily and symbolically effective. The formation of the group Los 26 de Julio was a central organizational step in the early phase of the revolution. Named after the failed attack on the Moncada Barracks, this movement united various oppositional currents against Batista. The group functioned not only as a military unit, but also as a political network that spread the ideological principles of the revolution and mobilized supporters within Cuba. The structure of Los 26 de Julio reflected Castro's ability to combine political organization, military planning, and ideological coherence. The planned attempt to return to Cuba, the so-called landing of the Granma in 1956, was a decisive moment. Castro, Guevara, and about 80 other fighters crossed over from Mexico to Cuba to start the guerrilla war in the Sierra Maestra. The landing was risky, the troops inferior, and the conditions extreme. Many fighters were killed or captured, but the survivors, led by Castro, established a base in the mountains. This phase was crucial for the development of a flexible, decentralized guerrilla strategy based on mobility, local support, and ideological persuasion. From the very beginning, the political dimension of the revolution was closely linked to military strategy. Castro understood that success could be ensured not only by military action, but also by winning over the population, propaganda, ideology, and building support networks. In the villages of the Sierra Maestra and the surrounding regions, the movement gained supporters by promising social justice, education, medical care, and protection. Poverty and inequality, which were particularly pronounced in these regions, provided fertile ground for the recruitment and mobilization of the population. The guerrilla strategy in the mountains combined military tactics with psychological warfare. Castro used the rough terrain to form smaller, mobile units that weakened Batista's troops through surprise attacks, sabotage actions, and information campaigns. At the same time, propaganda messages were spread that portrayed the revolution as a liberation movement. This combination of military action and ideological communication strengthened the legitimacy of the movement and built trust among the population. A decisive component was the international dimension. Castro and his comrades in arms used contacts abroad to mobilize financial support, equipment, and political capital. At the same time, they positioned the revolution as a symbol of resistance to authoritarian rule, imperialist influences, and social injustice. This international perspective strengthened moral legitimacy and helped stabilize the movement, even in phases of military setbacks. The early phase of the Cuban Revolution was characterized by a combination of long-term planning, strategic action, ideological coherence, and practical mobilization. Fidel Castro's ability to combine political visions, military tactics, and ideological convictions made it possible to build a sustainable revolutionary movement. Despite military challenges, logistical difficulties, and high losses, it was possible to establish a base that would ensure the later expansion and eventual victory of the revolution. To sum up, the beginning of the Cuban Revolution was a period of intense preparation, strategic planning, and ideological consolidation. Fidel Castro combined military skill, political mobilization, and ideological conviction into a coherent approach that structured and organized the resistance against Batista. The landing of the Granma, the establishment of the guerrilla bases in the Sierra Maestra, and the winning of the population as allies laid the foundation for the successful course of the revolution. These early activities show how Castro combined theoretical knowledge, practical experience, and strategic thinking to create a movement that would fundamentally change Cuba's political system. Chapter 6: Guerrilla Warfare in the Sierra Maestra. The guerrilla war in the Sierra Maestra represents a central phase of the Cuban Revolution and had a lasting impact on both Fidel Castro's military and political strategy. After the failed landing of the Granma in December 1956, the surviving fighters retreated to the remote mountainous regions of the Sierra Maestra, where they built up a base for resistance against the Batista regime under extreme conditions. This phase was marked by deprivation, military challenges, organizational skill, and the ability to translate ideological principles into practical action. The guerrilla campaign combined asymmetrical warfare, popular mobilization, and political propaganda into a coherent strategy that laid the foundation for the eventual success of the revolution. The Sierra Maestra, a mountainous area in eastern Cuba that is difficult to access, offered natural advantages for the guerrillas. The dense vegetation, steep slopes, and hard-to-pass paths made it difficult to deploy regular army units, while small, mobile units of the revolutionaries were able to carry out surprise attacks, retreat, and survive in the mountains. Castro recognized early on that the geographical conditions had to be used to compensate for Batista's numerically superior army. The mountains became a secure base from which strategic operations could be planned and executed. The living conditions of the guerrillas were extreme. Food was scarce, medical care was limited, and the constant threat of military action made daily life difficult. Despite these deprivations, the group remained disciplined, organized, and ideologically motivated. Castro placed great emphasis on training, cohesion, and moral conviction. At the same time, the physical challenges created a strong group cohesion, which was crucial for military effectiveness and psychological resilience. A central element of the guerrilla war was the connection to the population. Castro and his comrades-in-arms understood that the support of the local population was crucial to the success of the revolution. They helped the villages with everyday problems, distributed resources, offered protection from military actions, and provided education and medical assistance as far as possible. This practice ensured loyalty, information flows, and logistical support. Poverty, social injustice, and political oppression, which were particularly pronounced in rural regions, facilitated the recruitment of new fighters and the acquisition of sympathizers. The guerrillas' military strategy was designed for flexibility and surprise. Small, mobile groups carried out targeted attacks on military installations, supply lines, and communication networks. Ambush operations, acts of sabotage, and psychological warfare weakened the morale of Batista's troops and demonstrated the guerrillas' ability to operate successfully despite numerical inferiority. Castro combined military skill with strategic planning, with each battle having not only tactical but also symbolic significance. Every victory, even a small one, was used to strengthen the legitimacy of the revolution and gain international attention. Propaganda and ideological communication were integral parts of the guerrilla war. Castro and his comrades-in-arms spread messages about social justice, national sovereignty, and the need to resist the authoritarian regime. Radio broadcasts, leaflets, and oral reports spread the ideals of the revolution far beyond the Sierra Maestra. The population learned to see the guerrillas not only as a military force, but as a political movement that sought social change. This ideological component strengthened the moral conviction of the fighters and the support of the population. Another important aspect was the internal organization of the guerrillas. Castro established clear hierarchies, responsibilities, and communication structures. Each unit had specific tasks, whether reconnaissance, supplies, medical care, or combat operations. Decision-making processes were centralized, but flexible enough to be able to react to rapid changes. This organization combined military efficiency with ideological coherence, which was crucial for maintaining morale, discipline, and strategic orientation. The guerrilla war in the Sierra Maestra prepared the revolution for extensive expansion. Through the combination of military successes, political mobilization, and ideological communication, the movement grew continuously. New fighters joined in, support from peasants and workers increased, and Batista troops suffered continuous losses in morale and effectiveness. The guerrillas established not only a military base, but also a network of political and logistical structures that were decisive for the eventual victory. To sum up, the guerrilla war in the Sierra Maestra was a phase in which Fidel Castro's military, political, and ideological strategies merged into a coherent concept. The difficult living conditions, geographical isolation, and the permanent threat of Batista troops formed a determined, disciplined, and ideologically motivated movement. By combining military flexibility, political mobilization, and ideological communication, Castro laid the foundations for the eventual success of the Cuban Revolution. The Sierra Maestra experience shaped not only military tactics, but also the political vision that guided Castro throughout his reign. Chapter 7. Victory of the Revolution and Coming to Power. The victory of the Cuban Revolution in 1959 and the coming to power by Fidel Castro marked the decisive turning point in Cuba's history and represented the culmination of years of guerrilla warfare, strategic planning, and political mobilization. After years of resistance against the authoritarian Batista regime, which was characterized by corruption, repression, and close ties with foreign interests, Castro succeeded in pooling the forces of the revolution, winning the population to his ideals and decisively undermining the military superiority of government troops. The seizure of power was a result of a careful combination of military skill, political strategy, ideological clarity, and symbolic communication, which paved the way for the construction of a new political system. The last phase of the guerrilla war in the Sierra Maestra had fundamentally changed the balance of power in Cuba. Castro and his guerrilla fighters had continuously gained ground, successfully carried out military operations, and secured the support of the population. The Batista troops suffered from low morale, inefficient organization, and growing resistance from the population. The revolutionaries exploited these weaknesses by taking strategic locations, conducting information campaigns, and actively involving the population in the movement. This combination of military pressure and political mobilization led to the regime becoming increasingly isolated and unable to act. The symbolic value of Fidel Castro as a charismatic leader played a central role in the victory of the revolution. His ability to win followers both rhetorically and through personal presence strengthened the moral motivation of the guerrillas and strengthened the trust of the population. Castro knew how to combine his personality with the ideological vision of the revolution, so that he was perceived as a legitimate representative of the resistance and a moral authority. This image was crucial to secure the loyalty of the fighters and to mobilize the broad population, which was increasingly actively involved in the revolutionary process. The formal seizure of power began when Batista had to leave the country in January 1959. The president fled into exile, which abruptly changed the country's political order. Castro and the revolutionary forces advanced from their mountain bases in the cities to occupy key positions in government, administration, and military infrastructure. This process required careful planning, coordination, and diplomatic skill to avoid chaos while maintaining control of the country. The seizure of power was thus not only militarily but also administratively and politically strategically well thought out. A central challenge in the seizure of power was the stabilization of the new government. Castro had to find the balance between securing revolutionary goals, integrating various opposition forces, and maintaining order in a politically and socially divided country. The introduction of new administrative structures, the filling of key positions with loyal functionaries, and the creation of a unified political line were crucial to consolidate control and create the basis for the long-term implementation of the revolution. The social dimension of the seizure of power was equally important. Castro and his comrades in arms understood that the success of the revolution depended on addressing the needs of the population, especially in rural regions that had long been marginalized. Land reforms, education programs, and social support were used as central instruments to win over the broad population to the revolutionary goals and to ensure social stability. These measures combined practical assistance with political legitimacy and helped to strengthen popular confidence in the new government. International attention also played a role in the seizure of power. Batista's flight, the expansion of the guerrillas, and Castro's consolidating role attracted the attention of the international media and political actors. Castro understood the importance of this attention and used it to portray the revolution as a liberation movement that pursued not only national sovereignty but also social justice. This helped to consolidate the moral and political legitimacy of the new government, both domestically and internationally. The seizure of power was not without resistance and challenges. Some sections of the population, especially urban elites, businessmen, and conservative groups, were skeptical or hostile to the new government. The revolution therefore had to convince both through political communication and through targeted measures to secure the support of the general population. Castro relied on a mixture of rhetorical persuasion, symbolic actions, and practical politics to achieve acceptance and stability. In summary, the victory of the Cuban Revolution and the coming to power by Fidel Castro were the result of a long strategic, military, and ideological preparation. Success was based on the ability to combine military successes with political mobilization, ideological communication, and social integration. The seizure of power was not only a military triumph, but also a political, administrative, and social process that laid the foundation for the creation of a new system in Cuba. Castro established himself as a charismatic leader who translated revolutionary ideals into concrete political measures and led the country on a new historical path. This phase marked the beginning of a decade of profound changes that had a lasting impact on Cuba politically, socially, and economically. Chapter 8: Consolidation of Power. After the victory of the Cuban Revolution in 1959, Fidel Castro was faced with the challenge of consolidating his newly won power and permanently changing Cuba's political, economic, and social order. Building a stable government required both strategic skill and ideological profile. Castro had to translate military successes into political stability, integrate or neutralize opposition forces, and involve the general population through social programs and political communication. The consolidation of power was a multi-layered process that combined military control, institutional reforms, social measures, and international diplomacy. A central component of consolidation was the creation of administrative structures and the filling of important positions with loyal and ideologically convinced people. Castro and his closest comrades-in-arms, including Che Guevara and Camilo Cienfuegos, established a central leadership structure that bundled strategic decisions and at the same time was able to react flexibly to political developments. Control over the police, military, and intelligence services was crucial to prevent resistance, sabotage, or civil unrest. At the same time, civilian authorities have been reformed to make the implementation of social programs and the management of state resources efficient. The political integration of the population was another central factor. Castro understood that the legitimacy of his government could not be based solely on military success, but on broad social support. To achieve this, he initiated extensive campaigns to inform the population about the goals and values of the revolution. Propaganda, public speaking, training, and media relations have been systematically used to promote political loyalty, ideological identification, and participatory mobilization. These measures strengthened the bond between the government and the population and helped to stabilize the new order. A decisive aspect of the consolidation of power was the neutralization of political opponents. Many members of the old elites, conservative politicians, and businessmen posed a potential threat. Castro and his government used a mixture of integration, surveillance, and, in some cases, repressive measures to control the resistance. The balance between intimidation and co-optation was crucial. On the one hand, opposition forces had to be prevented from undermining stability, and on the other hand, it was necessary to promote broad social acceptance. This strategic combination contributed to the consolidation of revolutionary rule. Social reforms played a central role in consolidating power. Land reforms, education programs, health initiatives, and infrastructure projects have been implemented to improve the living conditions of the general population while gaining political support. Landowners were expropriated, land was distributed to farmers, schools were opened, and medical care was expanded. These measures not only strengthened social justice, but also legitimized the government ideologically. Castro presented the revolution as a movement for the people that corrected systematic injustices. Economic consolidation was equally crucial. Castro had to reorganize the economy in order to make production, distribution, and resource use in line with the revolutionary goals. Control over key industries, especially sugar production and energy supply, made it possible to use economic resources specifically for social programs and political goals. At the same time, trade relations and international dependencies were reassessed to secure national sovereignty. The economic strategy supported political stabilization by anchoring the government's power base while potentially marginalizing resistance. Castro's foreign policy strategy was also an important part of the consolidation of power. Relations with the United States and other Latin American countries had to be redefined, while at the same time establishing contacts with the Soviet Union and the Socialist Bloc. International recognition, economic support, and political legitimacy were crucial to stabilize Cuba on the global stage while securing internal reforms. Castro used diplomatic channels, propaganda, and ideological communication to position Cuba as an independent, revolutionary state. Cultural and ideological measures also supported the consolidation of power. Castro and his government fostered revolutionary consciousness through education, media, and public rituals. The population was introduced to the values of the revolution, social norms were adjusted, and a sense of collective responsibility and identity was strengthened. This ideological consolidation ensured long-term stability, as it was based not only on coercion but also on persuasion. To sum up, Fidel Castro's consolidation of power was a complex process that combined military control, institutional reforms, social measures, economic governance, political integration, and ideological communication. Castro used strategic thinking, rhetorical skills, and organizational skills to stabilize the new government, neutralize opposition forces, and involve the population in the revolutionary goals. The measures to consolidate power laid the foundation for Castro's long-term influence in Cuba and shaped the country's political, economic, and social structure for decades. They show how military success, political strategy, and social legitimacy can be combined in a coherent approach to establish sustainable rule. Chapter 9: Economic Reforms and Land Reform. After the seizure of power in 1959, Fidel Castro was faced with the urgent task of fundamentally reforming Cuba's economic structure. The country was heavily dependent on foreign investment, especially from the United States, and social inequalities were deeply rooted. Sugar production dominated the economy, while large parts of the population lived in poverty, especially in rural areas. Castro recognized that political stability and the long-term success of the revolution were inextricably linked to economic independence, social justice, and equitable distribution of resources. Economic reforms, especially land reform, were at the heart of his policies in the first years after the revolution and had far-reaching effects on society, politics, and international relations. The land reform of 1959 was one of the first and most symbolic measures of the new government. Large landowners, especially those with excessive land ownership, were expropriated and the land was divided into smaller parcels that were distributed to small farmers, cooperatives, and agricultural collectives. This reform aimed to correct the historical inequality in land distribution and to enable the rural poor to support themselves. The measure had not only economic but also political significance. It strengthened the population's ties to the revolutionary government, as the land reform directly improved the living conditions of many people and consolidated Castro's legitimacy as a leader of social change. Parallel to the land reform, measures were taken to modernize and control the economy. Key industries such as sugar production, energy supply, mining, and transport were nationalized in order to secure economic independence and use resources for national development projects. This enabled the government to invest revenues specifically in social programs, education, and healthcare. The strengthening of state control over the economy reflected Castro's understanding that economic power is closely linked to political stability. By regulating production, distribution, and trade, the government was able to reduce economic inequalities and strengthen the social basis of the revolution. The economic reforms also included the introduction of planning mechanisms. Centralized economic planning was intended to ensure that resources were used efficiently and social priorities could be implemented. Programs to promote agriculture, industrialization, and infrastructure development have been introduced to both increase productivity and improve the living conditions of the population. Through government investment in education, health, and social protection, the link between economic reform and social justice became clear, and the population received direct benefits from the changes. The land reform and economic measures also had social dimensions. Reducing the concentration of land and capital helped to change power structures that had increased inequality for decades. Small farmers, workers, and marginalized groups were given new opportunities for economic participation, while traditional elites were partially disempowered. This led to a redistribution of resources and influence, which changed both economic and political structures in the long term. Poverty, especially in rural areas, has been sustainably reduced through the direct improvement of production opportunities and living conditions. International reactions to these reforms were mixed and led to tensions, especially with the United States. The expropriation of land owned by American companies led to diplomatic conflicts, economic sanctions, and Cuba's increasing isolation in the Western economic space. These international tensions drove Cuba closer to the Soviet Union and the Socialist bloc, which had a lasting impact on the country's economic, political, and military orientation. The economic reforms were thus not only nationally but also globally significant, as they changed Cuba's geopolitical position. The land reform and economic measures had a long-term impact on Cuban society. They reduced dependence on foreign capital, promoted social justice, and strengthened the population's ties to the revolutionary government. At the same time, they posed a challenge for the economy, as increases in production, efficiency, and innovation had to be ensured within state-controlled structures. The reforms were a balancing act between social justice, economic performance, and political legitimacy. In summary, the economic reforms and land reform under Fidel Castro were central instruments for consolidating the revolution. They combined social justice, economic independence, and political stability. Through the redistribution of land, the nationalization of key industries, and central economic planning, Castro created the basis for a new social and economic system. The measures changed the balance of power in Cuba, improved the living conditions of broad sections of the population, and laid the foundation for the country's long-term ideological and political orientation. They show how economic reforms have not only economic, but also social and political dimensions and can be decisive for the establishment of sustainable power structures. Chapter 10. Social Policy, Health, Education, and Welfare. Social policy under Fidel Castro played a central role in consolidating the revolution and stabilizing the new government in the long term. After seizing power in 1959, Castro relied on comprehensive programs in the areas of health, education, and social welfare to sustainably improve the living conditions of the population and at the same time strengthen the political legitimacy of his regime. These measures were closely linked to the ideological vision of the revolution, which emphasized social justice, equality, and national sovereignty. They pursued not only the goal of fighting poverty, but also the creation of a new social identity and the integration of marginalized groups into the revolutionary process. A central element of social policy was the expansion of the healthcare system. Before the revolution, access to medical care in Cuba was highly unevenly distributed. Cities like Havana had modern facilities, while rural regions were largely underserved. Castro recognized that a nationwide healthcare system was crucial for social integration and stability. Hospitals, health centers, and medical care networks have been set up to reach both urban and rural sections of the population. Medical personnel have been trained and deployed throughout the island nation to improve care and implement prevention measures. This comprehensive health strategy made a significant contribution to increasing life expectancy, reducing infant mortality, and improving the overall quality of life. At the same time, a radical expansion of the education system was carried out. Before 1959, access to education was strongly influenced by social and economic inequality. Many children in rural regions did not have the opportunity to attend school regularly. Castro initiated a comprehensive literacy campaign that provided basic education to millions of Cubans while strengthening the ideological bond with revolutionary values. Schools were built nationwide, curricula reformed, and teachers trained. Education was understood not only as an instrument of knowledge transfer, but also as a means of social mobility and political integration. By promoting equal opportunities, the education programs contributed to the reduction of social inequality and the creation of a common national identity. Social policy under Castro also included direct welfare measures. Land reforms, subsidies, housing projects, food supply, and government support programs were aimed at reducing poverty and integrating broad sections of the population into the economic and social structure. Particularly disadvantaged groups, including rural farmers, working-class families, and children from poor backgrounds, benefited from targeted measures that improved their living conditions and strengthened their political ties to the revolution. The combination of education, health, and welfare created a comprehensive system of social security that effectively tackled poverty, social exclusion, and inequality. Another important aspect was the ideological component of social policy. Castro combined social action with the teaching of revolutionary values to promote political loyalty and social coherence. Health, education, and welfare were understood not only as practical help, but also as an expression of the revolutionary ideals of equality, solidarity, and national independence. This combination of social policy and ideological education strengthened the population's ties to the government and consolidated the legitimacy of the regime. The implementation of these programs was closely linked to centralized planning. Resources were allocated in a targeted manner to increase efficiency and reduce social inequalities. The government coordinated the distribution of personnel, materials, and funding to reach both urban and rural regions. This approach combined central control with local implementation, which achieved a nationwide impact while at the same time allowing local needs to be taken into account. The international dimensions of social policy were also significant. Castro used international support, especially from socialist states, to secure resources, medical knowledge, and teaching materials. At the same time, Cuba became a symbol of successful social reforms in Latin America and globally. The successes in the health and education systems made it possible to gain political support and moral legitimacy at the international level and to consolidate Cuba's image as a socialist state. Social policy also showed that the government was able to implement long-term structural changes. The sustainable improvement of education and health had a direct impact on economic performance, social coherence, and political stability. Through these measures, the regime was able not only to satisfy immediate social needs, but also to create a new social dynamic based on the ideals of the revolution in the long term. In summary, social policy under Fidel Castro was a central instrument for consolidating the revolution. The comprehensive promotion of health, education, and welfare combined practical help with ideological legitimacy, reduced social inequality, strengthened the population's ties to the regime, and consolidated Cuba's political stability. These measures show how social reforms can be targeted to combine political power, social coherence, and long-term development. Castro's approach made social policy an integral part of the revolutionary strategy and continues to shape Cuba in many areas of society today. Chapter 11. Foreign policy in the 1960s. Fidel Castro's foreign policy in the 1960s was marked by Cuba's realignment after the revolution, confrontation with the United States, and rapprochement with the Soviet Union. After the victory of the revolution in 1959, Cuba faced international isolation and economic pressure. The measures taken by the new administration, including the nationalization of U.S. property and land reform, led to a rapid break with the United States, which increasingly perceived Cuba as a threat to its interests in the Caribbean. These developments forced Castro to formulate an independent foreign policy that would secure national sovereignty, legitimize the revolution internationally, and guarantee the economic stability of the country. One of the first foreign policy measures was rapprochement with the Soviet Union. Cuba sought economic and military support as the U.S. blocked trade relations, financing, and imports. The Soviet Union recognized the strategic importance of Cuba in the context of the Cold War and offered economic support, technical exchanges, and military cooperation. This partnership was crucial to ensure Cuba's economic stability, close supply gaps, and ensure defense capability against possible U.S. aggression. It laid the foundation for a long-term strategic alliance that was to shape Cuba until the 1980s. The nationalization of U.S. property and the restructuring of the Cuban economy led to massive tensions with Washington. The U.S. responded with economic sanctions, trade restrictions, and diplomatic isolation. These measures forced Castro to seek alternative international relations and to market the revolution globally as a symbolic project. Cuban foreign policy in the 1960s therefore combined economic necessities with ideological communication. Castro presented Cuba as an independent, sovereign state that resisted imperialist influence and pursued social justice. A central event of this phase was the confrontation with the United States in the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. The discovery of Soviet intermediate-range missiles in Cuba led to a direct confrontation between Washington and Moscow and presented the new government with immense foreign policy challenges. Castro pursued a strategy of military deterrence and political communication. The crisis demonstrated not only Cuba's geopolitical importance, but also Castro's ability to strategically shape international relations, mobilize allies, and defend the revolution in the face of global threats. The Cuban Missile Crisis changed Cuba's international reputation and cemented its position as a key player in the Cold War. Foreign policy in the 1960s was also shaped by the ideological export strategy. Castro supported revolutionary movements in Latin America, Africa, and Asia by providing logistical, military, and political assistance. This strategy had several goals. It strengthened Cuba's global presence, propagated socialist ideology, demonstrated the effectiveness of the revolution, and created international networks of allies. Especially in countries such as Angola, Congo, and Bolivia, Cuba was actively involved in training, advice, and military support, whereby Castro understood the revolution as a transnational project. The economic dimension of foreign policy was closely linked to ideological and strategic goals. Cuba's trade and economic cooperation were increasingly oriented towards socialist states, especially the Soviet Union and its satellite states. This not only secured the supply of raw materials and energy, but also allowed Cuba to be integrated into alternative markets, which partially compensated for the U.S. boycott. At the same time, economic relations were used to strengthen political alliances, export ideology, and consolidate Cuba's position in international organizations. Diplomatic measures, propaganda, and international communication were also key elements of foreign policy. Castro used speeches at the United Nations, international travel, and media appearances to present the revolution globally and gain political support. The foreign policy of the 1960s was thus not only pragmatic, but also symbolic. It conveyed an image of Cuba as a self-determined, sovereign state that pursues social justice and fights against imperialist threats. This communication contributed significantly to the international legitimacy of the revolution. In summary, Fidel Castro's foreign policy in the 1960s represented a balance between national sovereignty, ideological coherence, and international pragmatism. The rapprochement with the Soviet Union, the confrontation with the United States, the export of revolutionary ideals, and the strategic use of international networks shaped Cuba's role in the Cold War. These policies strengthened the internal legitimacy of the government, secured economic resources, and positioned Cuba as a central player on the global stage. Castro combined military, economic, ideological, and diplomatic strategies to protect the revolution, win international support, and consolidate the power of the new regime in the long term. The 1960s thus laid the foundation for Cuba's long-term foreign policy and Castro's influence on international relations for decades. Chapter 12: The Cuban Missile Crisis and International Tensions. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 represents one of the central moments of international politics during the presidency of Fidel Castro and illustrates the strategic importance of Cuba in the context of the Cold War. After the 1959 revolution, Cuba had increasingly detached itself from the influence of the United States and established a close partnership with the Soviet Union. The nationalization of U.S. property, the introduction of socialist reforms, and growing ideological difference led to Cuba's increasing isolation and tensions with Washington. The stationing of Soviet medium-range missiles in Cuba was both an expression of these tensions and a decisive signal of the island's geopolitical importance in the global power structure. The crisis began in October 1962, when U.S. reconnaissance aircraft discovered the existence of Soviet missile bases in Cuba. These missiles posed a direct threat to the security of the United States and led to an immediate political and military confrontation. President John F. Kennedy responded with a naval blockade to prevent the delivery of more weapons and demanded the withdrawal of the missiles already deployed. For Castro, this situation was a dramatic event. Cuba was geographically close to the United States, militarily inferior and politically dependent on the support of the Soviet Union. The crisis therefore represented both a threat and an opportunity to consolidate Cuba's position in the international system. Castro pursued a strategy of strategic determination during this phase. He positioned Cuba as a sovereign state ready to defend its independence and used the crisis to strengthen the legitimacy of the revolution at home. At the same time, he was aware of the military superiority of the USA and therefore relied on the diplomatic support of the Soviet Union. This dual strategy of symbolic harshness and pragmatic action reflected Castro's ability to compensate for military weakness with political and ideological strength, while at the same time securing protection through international alliances. Communication during the crisis was crucial. Castro maintained direct contact with Nikita Khrushchev and coordinated the reactions with the Soviet Union. At the same time, he used propaganda to make the Cuban population aware of the threat and to mobilize the revolutionaries. Speeches, newspaper articles, and official pronouncements served to convey the message of resilience, independence, and international solidarity. These measures helped to boost the morale of the population and portray the revolutionary leadership as determined and capable of acting. The Cuban Missile Crisis had far-reaching consequences for international politics. The direct confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union led to intense diplomatic negotiations, in the course of which Khrushchev and Kennedy negotiated a compromise. The Soviet Union withdrew the missiles, while the US pledged not to attack Cuba and later to withdraw its missiles from Turkey. For Castro, this result was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it secured Cuba's military existence, but on the other hand, Castro felt only limited involvement in the negotiations, which relativized his independence. The crisis made it clear that, despite having a military protecting power, Cuba was still trapped in a global power game between superpowers. Within Cuba, the crisis strengthened Castro's political position. The population perceived him as a determined defender of national sovereignty, ready to defend Cuba even in an existential threat. This perception strengthened loyalty to the revolution and reduced the possibilities of internal opposition. The Cuban Missile Crisis thus functioned not only as a foreign policy event, but also as an instrument of political consolidation at home, allowing Castro to stabilize his power base and further spread revolutionary ideology. The long-term effects of the crisis were manifold. Internationally, Cuba became a central player in the Cold War and symbolized the resistance of small states to the dominance of global superpowers. The crisis consolidated Cuba's military and economic dependence on the Soviet Union, but also opened up new avenues for diplomatic negotiations and economic support. Cuban foreign policy became increasingly pragmatic, while at the same time defending the ideological principles of the revolution. The experiences of the crisis influenced Castro's strategy for the coming decades, especially the emphasis on military defense readiness, international networking, and the ideological coherence of the government. In summary, the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 represents a critical phase in the history of Cuba and the presidency of Fidel Castro. It highlighted the island's strategic importance in the global power structure, the need for international alliances, and Castro's ability to combine political, military, and ideological strategies. The crisis strengthened the internal legitimacy of the revolutionary government, increased Cuba's international prestige, and had a lasting impact on the island's foreign policy orientation. The events showed how, under Castro's leadership, Cuba was able to maintain an independent position despite its geographical proximity to a superpower and military inferiority, defending national sovereignty and making the ideals of the revolution internationally visible. Chapter 13. Relations with the United States. From the beginning of the revolution, relations between Cuba and the United States under Fidel Castro were marked by tensions, conflicts, and strategic rivalry. After the seizure of power in 1959, Castro pursued a policy that emphasized Cuba's economic, political, and ideological independence and at the same time implemented the social reforms of the revolution. This quickly led to a rift between Cuba and the United States, whose economic interests were strongly represented on the island and which perceived the nationalization of American companies and reforms in the country as a threat to their economic and geopolitical position. The relationship was complex from the outset, as it included economic, political, and military dimensions. At the beginning of the 1960s, tensions escalated, especially due to Cuba's extensive economic reforms. The nationalization of sugar plantations, tobacco farms, banks, and other predominantly US-owned companies resulted in significant losses for American companies and exacerbated political distrust between Washington and Havana. The US responded with economic sanctions, import bans, and the termination of diplomatic relations. These measures pushed Cuba further into dependence on the Soviet Union and forced Castro to develop a foreign policy aimed at survival, sovereignty, and ideological coherence. Relations with the USA thus became a central geopolitical factor from the beginning. A decisive point of the dispute was the ideological difference between the two countries. While the US promoted capitalism, private property rights, and democratic institutions, Castro relied on socialist principles, state control of the economy, and redistribution of land and resources. This ideological divergence led to a deep political confrontation. Castro openly opposed the dominance of American interests in Latin America and presented Cuba as an independent, sovereign state committed to social justice and national self-determination. This ideological positioning had a lasting impact on relations and made negotiations or rapprochements difficult. The US economic blockade had a profound impact on Cuba, forcing the government to establish alternative economic relations. Castro strengthened cooperation with the Soviet Union and other socialist states, which allowed the Cuban economy to stabilize while reducing dependence on Washington. This strategic reorientation was not only a reaction to American policy, but also an expression of Castro's long-term vision of making Cuba independent, self-sufficient, and politically sovereign. Relations with the United States became increasingly antagonistic as a result, while Cuba took a clearly defined socialist position in the global arena. Politically and militarily, the conflict escalated in various episodes that illustrated Washington's hostile attitude towards Cuba. These included the US-backed invasions, such as the Bay of Pigs in 1961, in which Cuban exile forces tried to overthrow the revolution militarily. Although this intervention failed, it confirmed Castro's security concerns and led to an even more militarized orientation of the Cuban government. Military threats, secret CIA operations, and attempts to destabilize Castro made relations permanently tense and led to a policy of defensive self-assertion that determined the relationship between the two states for decades. In addition to military and economic tensions, political communication played a central role. Castro used the media, public speeches, and international appearances to present the Cuban perspective and propagate the ideals of the revolution. The portrayal of Cuba as an independent, sovereign, and socially just state was intended to strengthen national legitimacy as well as gain international sympathy. This communication strategy was crucial to overcome isolation and secure Cuba's position in global politics. At the same time, it intensified the ideological confrontation with the United States, as Castro publicly criticized American policies and branded their interventions as imperialist. Despite the extremely tense relations, there have been phases of limited diplomatic interaction and indirect negotiations, often mediated by third parties or international organizations. The US continued to pursue political and economic strategies to isolate Cuba and weaken the revolution, while Castro used the negotiations to secure conditions for stability and sovereignty. These interactions made it clear that the relationship was characterized not only by hostility, but also by strategic calculation, in which both sides weighed their interests. In summary, relations between Cuba and the United States under Fidel Castro were marked by deep confrontation, ideological divergence, and strategic rivalry. Economic sanctions, military threats, and diplomatic isolation drove Cuba into the arms of the Soviet Union, strengthened revolutionary ideology, and consolidated Castro's domestic political power. At the same time, he used the international stage to legitimize the revolution, defend national sovereignty, and involve the population in the revolutionary process. Relations with the United States decisively determined Cuba's political, economic, and strategic orientation in the 1960s and shaped the country's long-term foreign policy for decades to come. Chapter 14. Relations with the Soviet Union and the Socialist Bloc. Cuba's relations with the Soviet Union and the Socialist Bloc under Fidel Castro formed a central pillar of Cuban foreign policy, especially in the 1960s and 1970s. After the 1959 revolution, Cuba found itself internationally isolated, mainly due to the hostile attitude of the United States, which imposed economic sanctions, broke off diplomatic relations, and made several attempts to destabilize the revolutionary government. Faced with this threat, Castro increasingly turned to the Soviet Union for political, economic, and military support. These relations were not only pragmatic, but also ideological. Cuba and the Soviet Union shared the common goal of curbing the influence of Western powers and consolidating socialism. The close cooperation began immediately after the escalation of tensions with the USA. The Soviet Union recognized the strategic importance of Cuba in the Caribbean and the Western Atlantic and offered extensive support to ensure the political stability of the revolution. This included economic aid, technological exchanges, military equipment, and advisors. For Castro, this partnership was of existential importance. Cuba was able to fend off the threat from the United States, support the establishment of a stable economic system, and at the same time continue to advance socialist reforms on the island. The connection to the Soviet Union was thus a decisive factor in the viability of the Cuban system. Economically, the partnership meant access to subsidized raw materials, energy, and technical goods. The Soviet Union bought Cuban sugar at fixed prices and provided loans and technological support for agriculture, industry, and infrastructure projects. This economic cooperation stabilized the Cuban economy in the face of the US blockade and allowed the continuation of land reforms, education programs, and the expansion of the health system. However, dependence on the Soviet Union was two-sided. Cuba received vital resources, but it also had to demonstrate political loyalty and ideological agreement to maintain the partnership. Militarily, the relationship with the Soviet Union played a decisive role. After the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 and the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, Cuba was heavily dependent on military protection. The Soviet Union provided weapons, training, and strategic advice that enabled Cuba to build an independent defense capability and repel possible US intervention. The deployment of Soviet medium-range missiles during the Cuban Missile Crisis illustrated not only the military dimension of this partnership, but also Cuba's strategic importance in the global Cold War. This military protection strengthened Castro's position, both in the face of external threats and within Cuba, as it ensured the stability of the revolutionary government. Ideologically, Cuba and the socialist bloc shared a common vision: the implementation of socialist principles, the transformation of the economy and society, and the fight against imperialist influence. Castro used this ideological proximity to legitimize reforms at home and promote international solidarity. Both economically and socially, Cuba was guided by Soviet models, but adapted them to the specific conditions of the island. This combination of ideological coherence and pragmatic adaptation made the relationship a stable instrument of power consolidation. Relations with the Soviet Union also had geopolitical implications for Latin America and global politics. Cuba acted as a pioneer of socialist movements in the region, providing support for revolutionary groups and providing strategic and ideological experience. The connection with Moscow provided Cuba not only with protection, but also with a platform to influence international debates and regional political developments. Cuba's foreign policy role was closely linked to the stability of relations with the socialist bloc and had a lasting impact on the country's international position. Despite a close partnership, Castro retained an independent political line. While Cuba benefited from economic and military support, it emphasized its national sovereignty and independence in political decisions. This balance between dependence and autonomy was a central feature of the relationship. Castro used the resources of the socialist bloc without being fully integrated into its power structure. This strategic independence enabled Cuba to take political initiatives, seek international solidarity, and independently implement revolutionary goals. In summary, Cuba's relations with the Soviet Union and the socialist bloc under Fidel Castro were a complex mixture of strategic necessity, economic cooperation, military security, and ideological solidarity. This partnership was crucial to the viability of the Cuban Revolution, the stabilization of the government, and the implementation of socialist reforms. At the same time, it allowed Cuba to shape its foreign policy, build international networks, and use regional and global influence. The close cooperation shaped the country's development for decades and made the relationship a central pillar of the Cuban power structure under Fidel Castro. Chapter 15: Political Repression and Opposition. Under Fidel Castro, political repression played a central role in securing power and consolidating the revolution. After the victory in 1959, the new government faced numerous challenges. Former supporters of the Batista regime, political opponents, entrepreneurs, intellectuals, and dissident groups posed potential threats to the stability and continuity of the revolution. Castro and his government were forced to establish a system of control, surveillance, and repression that both neutralized internal opposition and protected the ideals of the revolution. This system had a profound impact on Cuba's political culture, social structure, and international perception. Immediately after the seizure of power, the government began to persecute former Batista supporters. Many members of the old regime, including officers, politicians, and businessmen, were arrested, tried, and in many cases executed. These measures served not only to punish former oppressors, but also to intimidate potential opponents. Castro argued that these steps were necessary to defend the revolution and restore political order. At the same time, the harsh approach met with international criticism, as it was interpreted as a violation of basic human rights, while at home many citizens perceived the measures as legitimate and necessary for the protection of the revolution. The repression was directed not only against former Batista supporters, but also against opposition political movements and critical intellectuals. Parties that did not sympathize with the revolution were banned, media censored, and public gatherings monitored. The Cuban government established a system of political control characterized by centralized leadership, loyalty tests, and surveillance of the population. Dissident voices were often marginalized or suppressed, which greatly homogenized the political landscape and consolidated the power of the communist leadership. Opposition organizations could hardly operate, as the security forces were fully informed about the activities of the population. An important instrument of control was the establishment of an extensive security apparatus. Intelligence and political security services monitored both real and potential opponents, collected information about opposition networks, and prevented coordinated resistance actions. This surveillance served to prevent insurrections, acts of sabotage, and political destabilization. At the same time, it created an atmosphere in which potential adversaries withheld their activities for fear of repression and punishment. This instrumentalization of security structures was a central component of the consolidation of power and contributed significantly to the stability of the government. Castro also used ideological control as a means of repression. The education system, media, and public communication were used to convey the revolutionary values and marginalize alternative political views. Propaganda, speeches, newspaper articles, and cultural initiatives emphasized the legitimacy of the revolution, the need for socialist reforms, and the dangers of internal and external opponents. The aim of this ideological repression was to promote political loyalty, strengthen social coherence, and integrate the population into the revolution. It helped the government to secure its power in the long term, even in periods of economic or international uncertainty. Despite the harsh measures, there was always resistance at home. Dissident groups, Cuban exiles, and opposition movements sought to challenge the government, often through secret networks, acts of sabotage, or international public relations. These attempts at resistance led to further repression, increased surveillance, and a further centralization of power. Castro used this momentum to consolidate his position, delegitimize opposition movements, and strengthen the ideological loyalty of the population. The recurring confrontation between the opposition and the government had a lasting impact on Cuba's political culture and intensified the polarizing effect of repression. Internationally, the political repression was viewed critically and led to tensions with Western states, especially the USA and European democracies. Human rights organizations, political commentators, and governments criticized the systematic suppression of opposition and the restriction of political freedoms. At the same time, socialist and anti-imperialist forces saw Cuba as a model for defending revolutionary ideals against external threats. This dual perception makes it clear that repression was both a domestic political instrument to secure power and a foreign policy signal of the determination of the revolution. In summary, political repression under Fidel Castro was an integral part of securing power and consolidating the revolution. By persecuting former Batista supporters, restricting opposition groups, building a security apparatus, and ideological control, the government created a system that guaranteed political stability, loyalty, and social coherence. At the same time, these measures shaped Cuba's political culture, led to international criticism, and determined the dynamics of resistance and opposition for decades. Castro used repression not only as a means of neutralizing opponents, but also to ideologically consolidate the revolution and secure long-term political power. Chapter 16: Cuba's role in Latin America and Africa. Under Fidel Castro, Cuba played a central role as a regional and international actor that actively supported social and revolutionary movements in Latin America and Africa. After the successful Cuban Revolution in 1959, Castro saw the country not only as an island state with its own political and economic interests, but also as the hub of an international movement against colonialism, imperialism, and social injustice. Cuba's foreign policy in these regions was characterized by a combination of ideological principles, pragmatic support, and strategic interests. Castro used this international role to export the revolution, consolidate political alliances, and strengthen Cuba's global position within the socialist bloc. In Latin America, Cuba pursued an active policy of supporting revolutionary movements. Modeled after its own guerrilla strategies, Cuba provided training, logistical assistance, political advice, and material support to left-wing and anti-imperialist groups. Revolutionaries saw Cuba as a model for social and economic transformation, showing how marginalized sections of the population could be mobilized, social reforms could be implemented, and authoritarian regimes could be combated. Countries such as Bolivia, Chile, Nicaragua, and Venezuela experienced direct influence of Cuban politics, especially through the training of fighters, strategic advice, and ideological training that taught the principles of the Cuban Revolution. In Africa, Cuba played a significant role in supporting independence movements and anti-imperialist conflicts. Particularly noteworthy is the commitment in Angola, where Cuban troops were sent to support the MPLA against internal and external opponents from 1975 onwards. Cuba's military presence and advice contributed decisively to the political success of the movement and demonstrated its ability to strategically position a small nation in international conflicts. Castro saw these interventions as a moral obligation, but also as a strategic means to increase Cuba's international recognition and expand the influence of the socialist bloc. Cuban foreign policy combined military, political, and ideological strategies. Military support, training of fighters, and the provision of resources were used in a targeted manner to promote the goals of the local revolutionary movements. At the same time, ideological communication served to spread the principles of the Cuban Revolution: social justice, national sovereignty, anti-imperialism, and solidarity with oppressed peoples. Castro understood Cuba's international role as part of a larger geopolitical game in which small states, supported by strategic alliances, could gain influence in global conflicts. The political dimension was just as central. Cuba used its diplomatic channels to generate international attention for social and political grievances in Latin America and Africa. Through propaganda, media relations, and official diplomacy, Castro conveyed the message that Cuba was not only a national revolution, but also a model for resistance to oppression and injustice in other parts of the world. This combination of military support and political communication strengthened Cuba's international position and strengthened the loyalty of regional partners. Cuba did not act alone, but in close cooperation with the Soviet Union and other socialist states. This cooperation not only secured material support and military resources, but also legitimized Cuba's international role ideologically. The strategic proximity to the socialist bloc allowed Cuba to implement projects in Latin America and Africa that would not have been feasible without the support of international partners. At the same time, Castro maintained relative autonomy in political and military decision-making in order to represent the interests of Cuba and the revolution independently of Moscow directives. The long-term effects of this commitment were manifold. In Latin America and Africa, Cuban interventions contributed to the stabilization of revolutionary movements, strengthened anti-imperialist forces, and had a lasting influence on political developments. At the same time, Cuba's international prestige increased, while the country itself became more involved in global conflicts. The military presence and political support demonstrated the ability of a small state to gain disproportionate influence through strategic alliances and ideological coherence. Within Cuba, this international commitment consolidated the legitimacy of the regime. The population perceived foreign policy activism as an expression of the moral obligation to defend the ideals of the revolution globally. Foreign policy was therefore not only an instrument of geopolitical strategy, but also a means of strengthening national identity, promoting social coherence, and legitimizing the internal power structure. In summary, Cuba under Fidel Castro played an active and strategically important role in Latin America and Africa. The combination of military support, political advice, ideological communication, and diplomatic networking made the country a central actor in international conflicts of the Cold War. Castro used this role to export the revolution, gain international recognition, and consolidate Cuba's position within the socialist bloc. The foreign policy in these regions was thus an expression of Castro's ability to combine national interests, revolutionary ideals, and international strategies and to sustainably increase Cuba's global importance. Chapter 17: Economic Crisis in the 1990s. The 1990s marked one of the most serious challenges for Cuba under Fidel Castro, a deep economic crisis that threatened the country's material, social, and political stability. This phase, often referred to as the special period in peacetime, arose immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Cuba's main economic and political ally. Soviet support had previously guaranteed essential economic stability, energy supplies, and trade relations. With their disappearance, a large part of export revenues collapsed, imported goods became scarce, fuel and basic foodstuffs were lacking, and the entire economic system fell into an acute crisis. The causes of the crisis were both exogenous and endogenous. Exogenous was the loss of the Soviet Union as a trading partner, supplier of subsidized raw materials and guarantor of loans. Endogenous were structural weaknesses in the Cuban economy, which for decades had relied on centralized planning, monocultures such as sugar production, and state control over almost all sectors of the economy. This combination meant that Cuba was suddenly confronted with massive supply gaps, production stoppages, and a drastic decline in quality of life. Energy shortages led to power outages, fuel shortages affected transport and agriculture, and food shortages exacerbated the living conditions of the population. Fidel Castro responded to the crisis with a combination of emergency measures, economic reforms, and ideological communication. Initially, the focus was on securing basic services. Food rationing, energy savings, and resource mobilization were introduced to protect the population from the worst shortages. These measures showed how Castro combined crisis management with centralized planning to ensure the survival of the system. At the same time, the government has been forced to find creative solutions to keep the economy stable, despite the dramatic decline in raw materials, imports, and foreign exchange. One of the central strategies was the promotion of self-production and subsistence farming. Castro relied on agricultural collectives, urban agriculture, and local production to reduce dependence on imports. The population was encouraged to develop private and community initiatives to grow food, produce goods, and save energy. These measures temporarily changed the economic structure and led to a degree of decentralization that was hardly present before. The population had to learn new forms of cooperation, solidarity, and personal responsibility, which had a long-term impact on the country's social dynamics. Another important aspect was the opening up to limited economic experimentation. Castro allowed limited private initiative during this phase, such as small businesses, craft businesses, tourism services, and informal markets. These measures were aimed at generating foreign exchange, securing supplies, and creating economic flexibility without relinquishing central ideological control over the economy. The opening was limited and strictly regulated, but it reflected Castro's ability to respond pragmatically to external shocks and make necessary adjustments. The crisis also had profound social and political effects. The lives of the population were severely restricted, living standards and nutrition deteriorated, and a climate of insecurity emerged. Castro used intense ideological communication to motivate the population to survive the crisis, defend the revolution, and promote solidarity. Public speeches, media reports, and educational initiatives explained the causes of the crisis, emphasized the threat posed by external enemies, and called for collective effort. This communication was crucial to avoid social unrest and secure political loyalty during a period of extreme hardship. The international dimension also played a role. Cuba intensified its search for new trading partners, established relations with countries outside the socialist bloc, and used the increase in tourism revenues to generate foreign currency. The crisis forced Castro to undertake a strategic realignment, combining pragmatic cooperation and ideological principles to ensure economic viability. This strategy showed that Cuba was able to react flexibly to maintain the stability of the regime despite isolation and scarcity of resources. In the long term, the special period led to an adjustment of the economy, which initiated some lasting changes. The population learned to deal with scarcity, to use local production and private initiative, and to develop solidarity as a survival strategy. The economy gradually opened up without losing central control, and political structures were adjusted to stabilize the regime despite enormous strains. Through this phase, Castro proved his ability to combine ideological objectives with pragmatic crisis management. In summary, the economic crisis in the 1990s was one of the greatest challenges for Fidel Castro and Cuba. The collapse of the Soviet Union led to massive economic, social, and political problems. Castro reacted with centralized planning, self-production, limited economic opening, and intensive ideological communication. The crisis shaped the social structure, changed the economy, and strengthened political coherence, while at the same time highlighting Cuba's vulnerability in the international context. The special period shows how Castro combined crisis management, ideological conviction, and pragmatic adaptation to ensure the survival of the revolution in a period of extreme stress. Chapter 18. Cuba's Reforms in the 21st Century. The beginning of the 21st century marked a period of gradual reforms for Cuba under Fidel Castro and his successors, aimed at adapting the socialist system to new economic, social, and geopolitical realities. After the economic crisis of the 1990s, known as the Special Period, the island was economically weakened, the population was socially burdened, and Cuba's international position was increasingly challenged. The reforms of the new millennium were intended to increase economic stability, promote private initiatives, generate foreign currency, and at the same time maintain political and ideological control of the revolution. These reforms were characterized by a mixture of pragmatic adjustments, ideological consistency, and social protection. A central focus of the reforms was economic diversification. Cuba began to develop new sources of income beyond traditional sugar exports, including tourism, services, medical exports, and technology. Tourism has been deliberately expanded, hotels and infrastructure have been modernized, international visitors have been attracted, and urgently needed foreign exchange has been generated. Medical diplomacy, especially the sending of Cuban doctors abroad, not only served humanitarian purposes, but also brought income and international recognition. These measures represented a pragmatic balance to centralized economic planning and enabled Cuba to bridge economic bottlenecks. At the same time, limited private initiatives were promoted. Microenterprises, private restaurants, craft businesses, transport services, and other services were allowed, under strict government regulation and taxation. This opening created new jobs, increased economic activity, and gave citizens opportunities to increase income. At the same time, the state retained central control over key industries such as energy, healthcare, and education in order to uphold the ideological principles of the revolution. This dual structure, which combined central control with limited market opening, allowed Cuba to gain flexibility without jeopardizing political stability. Another component of the reforms was the modernization of fiscal and monetary policy. Cuba introduced new mechanisms to secure foreign exchange, encourage investment, and facilitate access to international markets. Foreign exchange, dual currency, and banking systems have been adapted to facilitate economic transactions, increase revenues, and encourage external investment. These financial reforms were necessary to make the economy more resilient to global fluctuations while maintaining political control over economic resources. Education and health remained central pillars of the reform strategy. Despite economic adjustments and private initiatives, universal social programs have largely been maintained. Schools, universities, hospitals, and public health centers have been modernized and further expanded. This continuity ensured that social justice, equal opportunities, and the ideals of the revolution continued to be taught. By combining reforms to increase efficiency with social protection, Cuba has been able to ensure stability and loyalty among its population, even in a period of profound structural adjustment. The reforms also included structural adjustments in agriculture. Faced with food shortages and the decline in agricultural production during the special period, land parcels, private cooperatives, and urban agriculture were promoted. Citizens were given more autonomy in the production, sale, and use of agricultural products, while the state continued to regulate the central objectives and access to resources. This measure served both food security and economic decentralization and reflected a pragmatic approach in an ideological framework. Internationally, the reforms were oriented towards pragmatic cooperation. Cuba sought new trade relations, expanded partnerships in Latin America, Asia, and Europe, and used international organizations to secure economic and political support. At the same time, Cuba remained ideologically coherent. Cooperation was deliberately used to preserve sovereignty and socialist structure instead of completely subjecting it to the international market economy. This balance between adaptation and ideological stability was crucial for the sustainable implementation of the reforms. The reforms led to a change in social dynamics. The population was given more economic leeway, could earn additional income and take new private initiatives, while central social services were maintained. This strengthened political loyalty, reduced discontent, and allowed for a moderate modernization of the economy without a fundamental break with revolutionary ideology. At the same time, this adaptation created challenges, such as income inequality and differences between urban and rural regions, which had to be mitigated through government regulation and social programs. In summary, Cuba's reforms in the 21st century under Fidel Castro were a mixture of pragmatic adaptation, ideological continuity, and social protection. The promotion of tourism, services, private initiative, financial modernization, and agricultural production enabled Cuba to overcome economic challenges, secure foreign currency, and take advantage of international cooperation. At the same time, education, health, and social justice remained central elements of politics in order to maintain the loyalty of the population and consolidate revolutionary ideals. These reforms show how Castro combined economic adaptation, political control, and ideological coherence in a globally changing world to ensure the stability and viability of the Cuban Revolution. Chapter 19. Withdrawal from active politics. Fidel Castro's withdrawal from active politics marked the end of an era that had profoundly shaped Cuba's history. After decades of revolution, the building of socialist structures and international influence, Castro decided to gradually hand over formal leadership to enable the transition to a new phase of Cuban politics. This process was not only an expression of personal age and health restrictions, but also a strategic decision to ensure the stability of the government, to ensure the continuity of revolutionary ideals, and to plan an orderly transfer of power. As early as the end of the 1990s, Castro increasingly receded into the background. The burdens of the long period of government, the demands on leadership in an isolated and economically challenged country, and health problems made it necessary to gradually reduce active tasks. Castro transferred responsibility to closely trusted followers, including his brother Raúl Castro, who had already held key positions within the party and the military. This transfer was carefully planned to ensure the continuity of the political line and to maintain the loyalty of the ruling classes and the population. The withdrawal was gradual and strategic. Castro initially retained an advisory and representative role, intervening in political, economic, and military decisions without being involved in operational management on a daily basis. This transition made it possible to stabilize the power structure and signal to the population and international actors that the revolutionary principles continued to endure, even if the formal leadership changed. The gradual nature of the withdrawal reduced the risk of political instability or internal conflicts within the party. Politically, Castro's influence was retained through ideology and public speeches. He used his position to convey the basic principles of the revolution, comment on reforms, and influence the strategic direction of the country. His presence as a symbolic figure and ideological anchor helped to legitimize the transition and bind the population to the ongoing revolution. Political communication played a central role, as Castro used it to ensure that his ideas continued to form the basis for decisions within the government. An important aspect of the withdrawal was the transfer of power to Raúl Castro. Raúl gradually took on leadership roles, leading important economic and military areas, and eventually formally becoming president. This process was characterized by transparency and clear communication in order to underline the continuity of the political line and prepare the population for the change of leadership. Fidel Castro played a central role as a mentor, advisor, and guarantor of stability, both strengthening loyalty within the party and preserving the ideology of the revolution. The withdrawal also had international dimensions. States, media, and international organizations around the world have been closely watching how Cuba dealt with the transfer of power. Castro's decision to hand over responsibility in an orderly manner conveyed stability and showed that the Cuban government remained capable of acting. At the same time, it signaled that the principles of the revolution would continue to form the basis of politics, even without the daily presence of Fidel Castro. International perception thus helped to secure the legitimacy of the new leadership and stabilize Cuba's position in global politics. The social impact of the withdrawal was also noticeable. For many Cubans, Castro's gradual withdrawal symbolized the end of a formative era that had had a significant impact on the country's life, economy, and international standing. At the same time, the clear handover to Raúl Castro conveyed continuity and security. The population could rely on socialist principles, education, and health programs, and centralized political control to be maintained, while the state implemented adjustments and reforms within a controlled framework. Castro increasingly withdrew in terms of health and personality. The burdens of the active political leadership over more than 4 decades had left visible traces, and the restrictions on his mobility and energy led to a significant reduction in public appearances. Nevertheless, his symbolic presence remained. He used speeches, letters, and public statements to motivate the population, support the political goals, and defend revolutionary principles. This retreat combined personal necessity with strategic calculation to stabilize the system and secure the ideology. In summary, Fidel Castro's withdrawal from active politics was a carefully planned, strategic process designed to ensure both internal stability and international legitimacy. By gradually transferring responsibility to Raúl Castro, maintaining ideological control and using symbolic presence, Cuba has been able to transition to a new phase without jeopardizing political and social coherence. The withdrawal shows how Castro combined personal constraints with strategic foresight to ensure revolutionary continuity and the long-term stability of the Cuban system. It marked the end of an era of intense political leadership, but ensured that the ideals of the revolution continued to form the basis of politics. Chapter 20: Legacy, Death, and Historical Evaluation. The legacy of Fidel Castro is a complex and multifaceted issue that affects politics, society, international relations, and ideology in equal measure. After more than 4 decades at the helm of Cuba, Castro left behind a nation whose political, economic, and social structures were strongly shaped by his vision and leadership. Castro's death on November 25, 2016 marked the end of an era that had profoundly influenced not only Cuba but also international politics. His life's work is assessed differently. For some, he is a hero of anti-imperialism and social justice, for others an authoritarian ruler whose repression and economic policies have had negative consequences. Castro's legacy can only be understood by considering both Cuba's internal changes and the global dimension of his policies. Internally, Castro shaped Cuba in almost all areas of social life. Education, health, social welfare, and infrastructure were greatly expanded under his leadership. He initiated comprehensive reforms that enabled near-universal literacy, universal medical care, and a social safety net. These achievements are considered by many to be a significant positive legacy, as they have sustainably improved the quality of life of the Cuban population and significantly reduced social inequality. Education and health became central pillars of the state, the impact of which can still be felt today. Politically, Castro left behind a highly centralized system that concentrated control of the party, economy, and society in the hands of a small ruling class. This enabled long-term stability and the implementation of reforms, but also had a repressive character. Political opposition was suppressed, freedom of expression was restricted, and power was highly personalized. Castro's ability to maintain a stable political order for decades demonstrates his organizational and strategic competence, but at the same time these measures raise questions about democratic legitimacy and human rights. The political dimension of his legacy is therefore ambivalent: stability and continuity on the one hand, authoritarian control and restrictions on the other. On an economic level, Castro left behind a mixed legacy. The centralized planned economy, nationalization of industry and agriculture, and dependence on the Soviet Union led to stability in certain periods, while external shocks, such as the collapse of the Eastern Bloc in the 1990s, caused deep crises. The economic reforms of the 21st century under his leadership sought to introduce flexibility and private initiative without undermining the ideological principles of the revolution. This balance between pragmatism and ideology shows how Castro responded to structural challenges, but at the same time created a system based on long-term state control. Internationally, Fidel Castro was a symbol of anti-imperialism and the global solidarity of small states. He supported revolutionary movements in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, built alliances with socialist states, and positioned Cuba as a self-determined actor in the Cold War. Cuba's international presence under Castro increased the geopolitical importance of the island, brought international attention, and influenced global power relations. At the same time, this policy led to confrontations with the United States, diplomatic isolation, and economic blockade, which burdened the country in the long term. Castro's foreign policy left behind a legacy of political symbolism, but also of complex economic and strategic dependencies. The perception of Castro differs greatly between different social groups and states. Within Cuba, he is revered by many as a revolutionary leader, defender of sovereignty, and guarantor of social benefits. Internationally, there is a divided assessment. Leftists, anti-imperialists, and socialist movements praise his steadfastness, his commitment to social justice, and Cuba's independence. Critics, on the other hand, highlight authoritarian governance, the restriction of political freedoms, and economic inefficiencies. This dual perception reflects the complexity of his work and shows that Castro's legacy includes both heroic and problematic aspects. His death in 2016 marked not only the end of a personal political age, but also the beginning of a new phase in Cuban history. The transfer of formal power to his brother Raúl and the gradual modernization of the economy indicate an attempt to combine continuity and adaptation. Castro remains present as a symbolic figure who shapes political legitimacy, revolutionary ideals, and national identity, even when direct political influence has ended. His presence in collective memory, in national rituals, and in international discourse shows that his legacy extends far beyond the years of his active leadership. To sum up, Fidel Castro was a historically significant leader whose legacy is ambivalent and encompasses multiple dimensions. Social progress, education, health, international solidarity, and political stability are in tension with authoritarian rule, economic centralization, and international isolation. His death marked the end of an era, but not the end of the structures and ideals he had created. The historical evaluation of Castro remains the subject of intense debate. He is seen as both a revolutionary hero and an authoritarian ruler. His life and work illustrate the complexity of power, ideology, and social transformation and remain a central chapter in Cuba's modern history and international politics.